Hey gang, so this is the second video for week 13, and it's following the Robert Scott video called Rhetoric is Epistemic, that reading. Thing is, that video has been recorded in a previous semester. I believe I made it for this class, and so it's still in line with the general kind of thrust of what we're doing here. But it's a little older. So this is now me talking to you in the fall of 2021. And just picking up the threads a little bit. Okay, so we are now in the final module of our semester towards shared understanding. And so we've come through months of looking at complicating factors to the serious man enterprise of coherence, clarity in communication, clarity in thought, clarity in speaking, trying to get rid of any kind of distortion, trying to get rid of any kind of manipulation, bad interpretations, misstatements, all this stuff that gets in the way of understanding, clean knowledge, assured behavior, sound policy, right? Like, these are the things that we would want. And the general semanticists are trying to acknowledge and account for all the potential kind of distractions and pseudo environments and all that kind of stuff. So we've been looking at all these kind of complications now for a while. And this last, frankly, just a couple of weeks, 2 weeks here, are on, okay, so now what can we do, right? Like, what can we try to think about to orient ourselves in a productive way? Instead of just thinking about all the problems and all the challenges, how can we try to move forward in a way that accounts for all this stuff, but still tries to build cooperative bridges and, get things done in a reasonable way, right? So we're trying to split the middle here between the rhetoric man side of things that's subjective and poetic and irrational, and we've been sort of entertaining all that, and the serious man that's all rigid and strict and all about clarity and coherence, which seems like pie in the sky, right? So we're trying to split the middle here toward the end and think about some useful ways of proceeding, accounting for the things that need to be accounted for. So the first video is on rhetoric as epistemic, which makes the argument that we need to just acknowledge that things are contingent. They constantly change and move and evolve, and we're always trying to catch up. My goodness, think about the pandemic situation and the constantly evolving nature of information and advice, and how do you make good decisions? How do you make good reasoned judgments when everything's on the move? This last year and a half or whatever has been a really good example of what Scott's talking about there in terms of the fact that the lives we live socially, culturally, politically are always on the move, always in flux, right? Rhetoric is the thing that tries to deal with that fluctuant reality, whereas opposed to philosophy and dialectic that are trying to think about stuff that cuts across all time and all change and what's consistent. Rhetoric man needs to be thinking about action in this world, here and now, right? And so Scott gives us those three ethical principles, like tolerance, will, responsibility, I think that's it. It's been a while. But anyway, so that's good. That's a good grounding. And then this piece by Rushkoff, a little bit more from the Rushkoff book, Team Human, which I just love this book. Hope you've gotten it. I hope you're interested in it. Go check it out. Go look into it. It's an easy read, but it's really engaging and provocative. And this little selection here, which I'll get through in just a couple minutes because it's nothing challenging, really, it makes a really interesting and useful point, right? We tend to think of, the serious men tend to think of nature as competition, very Darwinian, right? It's competition and everyone's out to get each other, and, we need to be clear about that and very kind of transparent about it and, is what it is kind of thing. Well, Rushkoff's making a different kind of an argument, and he's kind of trying to beat them at their own game by appealing to nature, right? He's telling a different story. He says right off the bat, nature is a collaborative act, right? So we tend to think of survival of the fittest and competition and adaptations all about, one species or one member of a species trying to beat out everyone else. He's saying, no, not more often than not, nature is cooperative and collaborative. And in every important respect that we can think about our own humanity, it's grounded in that reality, that we are cooperative, collaborative beings who essentially need one another. And language fills up that space of need, of trust, of cooperative enterprise. So we'll get there. He says, third paragraph, evolution is every bit as much about cooperation as competition. Our very cells are the result of an alliance billions of years ago between mitochondria and their hosts, right? Like we can do this together better than we could do it apart. Individuals and species flourish by evolving ways of supporting mutual survival. This is really interesting. I'm intrigued by this, right? Next paragraph toward the end, he says, by viewing evolution through a strictly competitive lens, we miss the bigger story of our own social development and have trouble understanding humanity as one big interconnected team. Team human, right? So he's trying to push this notion that, like, when we are all about, like, capitalism is competition, cutthroat, jungle, go get them, right? These are more aberrations of our kind of basic cooperative instinct than working together, right? Even free markets, even competitive markets rely on a huge amount of cooperation. As I'm recording this video, we have massive problems in our supply chain and with our labor shortage right now, right? So I'm going to this grocery store a couple times a week and I'm just like, holy cow, where is everything? Entire shelves are just empty, right? And what's behind this is this massive supply chain that spans the entire globe. It involves trains and boats and ports and trucks and people throwing things on truck and big heavy equipment taking these containers off of ships. It's a fascinating distribution complex, right? And normally it's staffed by people doing the important job of moving things along. But what happens when there's labor shortages or when companies are going out of business because there's not enough demand and, you know, all the shutdowns and all the quarantine means that, like, everything's kind of grinding to a halt and now we're trying to kick things back into gear, but it's not really happening. We're seeing how much of the global supply chain is a cooperative, distributive enterprise, massively complex, and what happens when that cooperative phenomenon starts to kind of lose some parts, some segments, or when key players and key entities and agencies and organizations start to kind of drop away, then you see the empty shelves. This is what I'm seeing when I'm seeing these empty shelves. I'm thinking about Vietnam, I'm thinking about India, I'm thinking about China and how things get over here. It all seems magical because we can't see it, but it's very real. It's very material. If you go out in the ocean, you'll see all these ships. If you go to the ports, if you go to LA and San Francisco and New York, you'll see these massive ports that are bringing these ships in and these crates. And it's just all fascinating and wild. And again, it is this kind of cooperative thing. Even though we're competing in a global marketplace, we're also cooperating for that competition, right? The most successful of biology's creatures coexist in mutually beneficial ecosystems. Nice. The top of the next page, 12, I wrote, yes! He says, we tend to look at life forms as isolated from one another. A tree is a tree, a cow is a cow, but a tree is not a singular tree at all. It's the tip of a forest. Pull back far enough to see the whole, and one tree's struggle for survival merges with the more relevant story of its role in sustaining the larger system. So in my work and in some of my other classes, I take an ecological approach to rhetoric, which is trying to think hard about the material, physical interrelations between conditions and phenomenon, right? And so when we are consuming something, what is that act of consumption connected to? Where does it go back? How many different entities are touched or have been touched in order for me to eat that thing or drink that thing, right? And so it's all kind of cooperatively interrelated. And, you know, the very notion of an ecosystem is like, here is this kind of space, this sort of territory, and all of these things, the trees, the animals, the critters, the sunlight, the water, it's all kind of interconnected. And it's a cooperative kind of phenomenon in that way. Yes, there's competition within that, but in the largest sense, everything's sort of mutually dependent on everything else, benefiting from everything else. And when one thing goes out of balance, then it throws other things out of balance. And so we're seeing this in spades today, right? And we're also seeing it with the virus itself, with the COVID virus itself, which is the only reason that it hops from body to body is because we engage in these socially cooperative practices and rituals. We go to games together, we go to concerts together, we go to meals together because we love that social cooperative thing. It's part of who we are. That's his kind of key argument, is what it means to be human. To be cooperative is what it means to be human. We are losing that today, right? We're hearing a lot about the problems of mental health with kids in middle school and high school. I'm acutely aware of this. I have a boy in middle school, and it's tough. It is hard times, being isolated, being away from people, being behind masks, being tucked in your room. This is not what we're accustomed to. And so we're dealing with all kinds of isolation issues and problems. I don't know, there was a video that was making the rounds a couple years ago having to do with addiction. It was based on some psychology research. I want to say it's a Canadian scholar or set of scholars that came up with this discovery that drug addiction, severe drug addiction, is often mostly connected to social isolation, right? So they did this experiment where they had, the rats or the mice or whatever, and they gave, they put that creature in isolation and let it have access to drugs or something powerful, and it just took it, and created a really bad addiction, right? Now take that critter and put it in amongst other critters and also make that drug available, and it's not interested in the drug because it has all this social stimulation and all this connection. And that's with a rodent, right? Like, human beings are much more oriented socially. So isolation is really, really bad. And so, yes, it feeds on itself with drugs, with isolation. These things only promote that, right? And so this is basically why he's writing this book, is like, look, these things are wonderful. We like these for so many different things, but they do push us further apart from one another. And then we engage one another virtually, but the nature of that engagement is very different, right? It's tweaked in so many ways. There's anonymity. There's a false sense of outrage, and, all the emotions that we feel are kind of turned up volume-wise, because that's the nature of the beast, right? And we've talked about that already. So we're getting a really warped sense of our social, the nutrients that we need. We're not getting them, and we're getting sort of bad versions, junk society, junk social interactions. And so we're seeing the effects of all this in our politics and our culture, the amount of outrage and polarization. And he's sort of suggesting that we need to kind of find one another again somehow. So the last thing I wanted to kind of look at is on the bottom of 17 there. He says, evolution's crowning achievement was the emergence of spoken language. It was a dangerous adaptation that involved crossing the airway with the foodway. That's interesting, making us vulnerable to choking. But it also gave us the ability to modify the sounds that came from our vocal folds and make that variety of mouth noises required for language. The effect of this, as he says on the next page, is language changed everything. Once people acquired speech, cultural development, and social cohesion no longer depended on increasing our brain size. Language was this brilliant, magical, invisible, virtual kind of phenomenon that allowed us to be the cooperative beings that we already are, right? Language is such a great tool for organizing, for accomplishing things. I mean, here we are. I'm talking to you at a distance through language, through screen and mediation. Hopefully, some ideas are landing, and hopefully there's some sense of learning and, oh, I get that, or I understand what he's saying here. And that would be the kind of cooperative extension of what he's talking about, using language to build connections, to inform and enlighten. And then page 20 says, the reverse is also true. Disconnection from one's social group leads to higher rates of depression, illness, and mortality. That's the example I just gave with the rats and the drugs, right? A baby starved of social contact has difficulty developing a regulated nervous system. Young men with few social acquaintances develop high adrenaline levels. All this school shooting stuff, right? Isolation, drug abuse, depression. We have rampant problems in these areas. Young men with few social, lonely students have low levels of immune cells. Prison inmates prefer violence to solitary confinement. That's like the worst thing you can do to a person is just deprive them of every social sensibility, right? Darkness, isolation, no human contact. People just go crazy. In the U.S., social isolation is a greater public health problem than obesity. Some sobering stuff here, but also I think kind of encouraging and even inspiring. It's sort of like, look, we're missing out on our very kind of programming, our sort of biological human social programming, which is like we are accustomed, we've evolved to be cooperative. Yes, there's lots of conflict and war and tension and all the rest of it, but boy, do we cooperate well when we need to, and we can, and we have it in us, and we have all the tools at our disposal. We just sort of like in this really rough moment of detachment and isolation, and then we have these kind of pseudo mediational tools that help us stay connected, but it's a weird bad connection. It's like it's a fabricated connection. And hopefully you've had this experience of like during quarantine you have meetings with friends and you have conversations on the phone with friends or maybe family or colleagues or whatever, and it's okay. Or maybe your job involves what I'm doing right now is like mediating from a distance, and it's okay. But hopefully you've had that sense of like, I really just miss going to a coffee shop, sitting down with my friends and getting caught up and talking and that. My whole thing is like food and restaurants and dining and that whole world. And I just think like, my goodness, I hope we never tire of going out to a meal together. Everything right now is like grab and go and delivery and convenience. And yes, we like convenience, but we also need that time together, to get together, to be together, and to go to parks and to be out and to be, connected. It's not just like a luxury. It's a necessity. That's the argument he's making here. Is this is a necessity, and we're kind of losing the plot, and we are succumbing to these devices and these tools that really are putting distance and creating that feeling of disconnection and isolation. So the book is really an attempt to try to like remind us of that and to try to find our way back. So this final set of readings in the class here is really a little bit kind of hopeful, optimistic, and maybe a little willfully so, right? It's like, yes, there's all of this stuff, but the only way we're going to get through any of it is to try to rediscover cooperation, rediscover each other, even if we think, that there's monsters amongst us. Like, things are going to be worse if we just keep spinning in this direction, So it's hard times. Cooperation is necessary. Finding each other, reconnection. We've got pandemics. We've got all kinds of political turmoil. We've got like so much cynicism and misery and depression and anger and resentment. And it's hard to know how to cut through all this. And, this is a very modest kind of drop in the bucket, but it's an important one to be reminded of this, to be reminded that this is more or less how we are wired to be together, socially, cooperatively. Language exists more or less for this very purpose. I can't remember where I read this, but it stuck in my head that it's very possible that the first word, the first use of human language ever was along the lines of help. I like this notion that the first word ever spoken was help. It would make sense, right? Which is, here's me, here's you. We need something to help us cooperate and live together and co-inhabit this space, this environment. And this sound comes out, which gestures toward some other person or entity to say, I need, right? Or like, please, or something like this, to that beckoning kind of request. And then from there, social ties and cooperation and collaboration. And then we've got cities and towers and, all the rest of it. We're going to the moon, right? Like what we've managed to accomplish with language, with our brains, with our social cooperative activities is pretty astonishing. And it all feels pretty perilous at the moment. So let's remember, cooperation is not just what we're about, it's what more or less everything's about, is interconnection and reliance and dependence and that very necessary and important notion that, we're kind of all on this rock together and we kind of drown together or we swim together. So let's start there. Let's see what we can do. All right. Cheers.